Hi, everyone. Welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and guy whose mom probably took a lot of Tylenol while pregnant, Bludgley. In today's episode, part 2 of our book chat on David French's Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. As discussed last episode, this is going to be the final book chat for the foreseeable future, and from here on out, we'll be moving into less literate waters. Nothing much else to say in terms of housekeeping, so let's just jump right in. Alright, to start, let's sum up the parts of French's book we've gotten into so far. French is worried that the current politically divided state of America is such that we are in serious danger of facing a violent secession crisis, in other words, a crisis in which either actual violence or threatened violence causes America to break apart into two or more countries. Specifically, French suggests that there are 4 factors currently present in America, which make us particularly at risk of violent secession from one side of the political spectrum or the other. These factors are 1. Political division that has people on either side of the political divide viewing the opposition as enemies to destroy rather than rivals to defeat. 2. Regional homogeny, clear regional or other geographic divisions that neatly track differences in political and cultural traits. 3. Fear that those who live outside your region are actively planning to take away your ability to self-govern and will instead impose unwanted political and cultural values upon you. And 4. A willingness to be motivated by that fear to utilize violence as a way to defend or overcome the external parties you view as a threat while uniting with others in your homogeneous region who share your politics and culture. French then presents 2 scenarios where all of these factors are present. One where California triggers a secession crisis by refusing to recognize the Second Amendment after a devastating mass shooting, and one where a coalition of southern states, headed by Texas, push for secession after the federal government restores the right to an abortion. Though the details of these secession scenarios sometimes stretch credulity by making them turn on crucial issues within the American political consciousness that are not susceptible to compromise or half measures, French has tapped into a genuine fault line that could widen enough to split America apart. However, there was a lot we didn't talk about last time. Namely, what does French think we should do to avoid these outcomes? How does he think we can solve the problems he spends most of the book describing? And to what extent does localism agree with French's arguments that America is at risk of secession violence, his proposal for how to avoid that outcome, and indeed whether it's desirable for America to stay one country in the first place? That's what today's episode is going to be all about. So after doomsaying about the potential future of America, where we all have a nasty breakup, French goes on to give his take on how that future can be avoided. You'll notice that this is a pattern in the books we've discussed in our book chats. The author first describes the political problem and then goes on to present a solution to the problem he's just described. And by truly shocking coincidence, that solution often tends to further the author's own politics. And given that we know French would be a conservative, somewhat libertarian, founding fathers glazer, what do you suspect his solution will be? That's right, it's probably going to be something along the lines of, gee, we should all just leave things to the states and do more free speech and make America more like the founding fathers' vision. I mean, let's just start off with what French calls the section of Divided We Fall dedicated to proposing solutions. Title: To Save America, Chart James Madison's Course. And what does French consider James Madison's course to be? Well, to start off with, pluralism. Quote, by protecting the liberty of our citizens, including by protecting their rights to form free and voluntary associations, we are not only increasing the ability of diverse human beings to find community and purpose within the body politic, we are limiting the ability of the state or any private faction to gain the overwhelming power to reasonably believe that it can achieve dominance. To French, pluralism involves paying 2 costs in order to achieve that important gain. These costs are, quote, first, if you are a citizen of a pluralistic liberal republic, you need to defend the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself, even when others seek to use those rights to advance ideas you may dislike or find repugnant. This is stuff like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. To French, these rights represent civic and moral goods, worth defending, and they are the rights that provide each individual with hope for fairness and change regardless of the outcome of any political contest. They are the rights that stand as a firewall against political violence exactly because they provide that hope for change. No citizen should feel that their only recourse to achieving the justice they deserve, or the liberty that is their unalienable right, is by picking up the rifle in their closet. Side note here, as a responsible gun owner and supporter of Second Amendment rights myself, I better not fucking catch you storing rifles in unlocked closets. Not only is that unsafe as shit, it also opens you up to criminal penalties depending on where you live. Anyway, back to French. The second cause French suggests we have to pay for pluralism is, quote, if you are a citizen of a pluralistic liberal government, here liberal in the classical sense, i.e. focused on individual rights and government non-interference, you should defend the rights of committees and associations to govern themselves according to their values and their beliefs, so long as they don't violate the fundamental rights of their dissenting members. American liberty and the American Revolution were never about radical individual autonomy. They were never about smashing institutions for the sake of liberating the individual. In other words, the American Revolution was no French Revolution. It was no cultural wrecking ball that sought to sweep away entirely not just the old form of government, but also the national faith itself, replacing it with the cult of reason. Instead, in so many ways, it was an effort at cultural preservation, with the colonists' rights grounded in their understanding of the rights of English citizens and the rage rooted in the denial of those rights. I'm not yet going to take up French's claims about whether pluralism is desirable or whether he's correct about the prices we have to pay for it. Instead, a quick word on this very interesting characterization of the American Revolution, which is relevant because French claims that the federal constitution embodies the priorities and preferences of those who fought in the revolution. It makes sense why French would want to downplay potentially how radical the American Revolution was. After all, the revolution basically involved exactly the kind of violent schism that French depicted in his Calixet and Texas scenarios. So French has to explain why the violence was okay in the revolution, but not in the case of secession. But frankly, I just don't buy what he's selling when he says the revolution wasn't about, quote, radical individual autonomy. That might have been the case in some places, sure, but just like today, the colonies were very different places, with their own particular reasons for supporting a violent war of secession from Great Britain. For example, after the start of the Revolution, some states passed state constitutions that radically lowered property requirements for voting, and some of those state constitutions included individual rights that went far beyond what was present in colonial governments at that time, or that would ultimately be included in the Federal Bill of Rights. And as always, we have to remember that the American Revolution was not an affair fought solely by urban or other middle-class intellectuals. The soldiers who made up the Continental Army and froze their asses off at Valley Forge and put their bodies in the line of harm, all of whom were volunteers, were comprised of both officers and ordinary infantrymen. While the officers did tend to hail from the middle or even upper classes, the average enlisted man was working class and fighting in part because there were lots of promises made about pay and land and food for soldiers. This group of working-class soldiers also included a serious contingent of black people, who made up as much as 1/5 of the Northern Continental Army, which, in a move that wouldn't be repeated all the way until World War II, was actually a racially integrated army. And the Revolutionary Army repeatedly promised slaves freedom in exchange for military service. I don't know about you, but I'm fighting the British so I can gain my freedom and create a country where all men are equal and slavery is wrong sounds a whole lot like a fucking fight for radical individual autonomy to me. And even if you weren't a black working-class guy, when you were at Valley Forge being miserable and receiving questionable pay and even more questionable food, I guarantee you that the rank and file were not keeping themselves warm with thoughts about how, well, my foot has frostbite, but at least I'm preserving my English culture and rights as an English citizen. No, to not let that suffering and the overwhelming odds of fighting the big British swinging dick of an imperial army, these guys had to believe that they were also fighting for a vision, a future, a country that would be better and different from the former manner of rule because it would recognize their rights as individuals and give them more individual freedom. In the heavily class and race-based world of colonial America, that desire and that imagined country absolutely represented a cultural wrecking ball that sought to sweep away an old form of government, even if French is right that it didn't quite reach the levels of French Revolution guillotine hysteria. It's especially shocking to see French claim that, there was only one animating principle for the American Revolution, after he's just waxed so convincingly poetic on the benefits of pluralism, and of how the Founding Fathers viewed America as a place where many different political groups and perspectives could coexist. It's certainly true that I'm sure there were people who fought the Revolutionary War for the reasons that French describes, but an army as big, as ragtag, and as diverse as the American Revolutionary Army was going to contain many different groups, with many different political perspectives on why their military action was necessary. Places in the text like these show that while French can posture himself as an, I'm just a little guy who wants us all to get along and it's my birthday, type throughout the book, at the end of the day, he's absolutely bringing his own agenda and his own biases to bear here. Okay, rant over. Putting aside his weird desire to paint over what the Revolutionary War was about, French is basically saying here that he thinks America needs to be more pluralistic, and that this pluralism, god fucking damn it, pluralism. That's hard as shit to say. I'm keeping that in. And he thinks this pluralism must be achieved by protecting both our essential civil liberties and the rights of others to use those civil liberties in ways that we personally may not agree with. To French, this helps avoid violent political outcomes because so long as the use of these civil liberties remains intact, then individuals feel like they have a path towards political agency without needing to resort to violence. What else does French have to say about how to avoid a secession crisis? Next, French calls on us to rediscover tolerance. Now, as French himself acknowledges, the term tolerance today tends to have a very specific meaning that is most often espoused by people on the left wing. That is not, repeat, not, the sense in which French is using the word. Instead, French suggests we embrace a kind of tolerance that involves focusing on people we disagree with rather than those we agree with. In the same way that you might tolerate a horrible dinner with your weird racist uncle, kind of. Under this kind of tolerance, a liberal shows tolerance towards a MAGA Republican, and a MAGA Republican shows tolerance towards a liberal. It's the idea of accepting that the other person may be wrong and definitely disagrees with you, but they should be able to do their own stupid thing if they want to. Now, French punctuates this suggestion that we re-embrace tolerance with a bit of classic both sidisms that point to the masterpiece cake shop case involving a religious cake shop owner who wouldn't sell a trans person a cake, and the NFL kneeling scandal when Trump called for players and team owners who knelt during the anthem to be fired as examples of non-tolerance, which, I don't know, okay. He also was very clear that he thinks liberals are much worse about being tolerant than right-wing people are, saying, quote, "Since progressives controlled the heights of American culture, they have disproportionate power to impose their will. They're different from the right. They're worse than the right." Now, as a card-carrying lefty myself, I will frankly tell you that it's my opinion that French's suggestion that progressives control the heights of American culture is him being stupid as fuck at best and deliberately lying at worst. It's a classic case of someone claiming that a particular viewpoint is simultaneously something that belongs to a group of niche weirdos, but is also a pernicious ideology that actually has widespread acceptance. There are many right-wing views that get a similar treatment from Democrats, but I'm picking on French here because he's presenting himself as this enlightened both sides guy, but also just kind of saying shit that is untrue. In my view, anyone who sees the current American culture as anything where one side's political value set or the other is ascendant is out of touch. There's plenty of room in the American political culture for a lot of conflict, a lot of contradiction, and a lot of cultural values that draw from both sides of the political spectrum. But like with this discussion of pluralism, let's put aside the weird political baggage that the conservative French can't help bringing in with him and focus on his broader point, that both right-wing and left-wing people could learn to be more tolerant of one another, in the sense of disliking each other, but accepting the other person has a right to their own viewpoints. So we've got pluralism and tolerance to keep the guns from talking. Anything else? Bet your ass. We've saved French's favorite, indeed conservatism's favorite, for last. Federalism. What is federalism? Well, it's got a more technical definition if we wanted to be all fancy about it, but in the sense that we care about, it's basically the idea that the American form of government is deliberately designed to create a specific balance of power between multiple levels of government. In other words, is designed to leave certain responsibilities to the federal government and certain to the state government. But when anyone in America these days invokes federalism, regardless of if the person who is invoking federalism is right-wing or left-wing, what that person means is that more things should be left to the states and less things should be assigned to the federal government. Thus, a federalist nation, under this view, is one in which we have 50 state governments, each doing their own thing and largely managing their own affairs, while a weaker central federal government maybe handles one or two things that it makes sense to address on a national rather than state-by-state basis. What those things exactly are is up to debate and depends on whether it's Democrats or Republicans who feel like arguing in favor of states' rights on any given day, but that's the gist of it. Here's what French has to say about why he views federalism, and specifically a return to federalism as the Founding Fathers envisioned it, as essential to stave off violent secession scenarios. Quote, "Perhaps one of the most frustrating things about our mutual hatred, our furious anger, and our extreme fear of the other side is that the solution is available, it's easily described, and it's right there in the Constitution of the United States. It's the 18th century solution to our 21st century problem. It would de-escalate national politics, reinvigorate self-governance, and restore a world where every vote undoubtedly counted. Every citizen would have a voice in the life of their community, yet nobody really seems to believe in federalism. Each side is hypocritical about it, and the will to power continues to trump any temptation to, for example, let California be California and Tennessee be Tennessee." French goes on to suggest that federalism is not being embraced by any major political party because it would mean surrendering the dream of total domination over a politically homogenous America, a dream born from the belief that political opponents are evil enemies that must be purged from the political sphere. He suggested this change and that we must embrace federalism, as doing so would allow us all to stop fighting over federal-level stuff that drives violent secession impulses and instead achieve successful political agency close to home. After all, if you're allowed to run things how you want in your own state, subject to the top-level civil rights granted by the Constitution, then seceding is no longer necessary. You can achieve the political or cultural outcomes you want and protect the values you care about via the ordinary political processes that now have been realigned to function on a state-by-state level. I think that's a fair characterization of French's point on this anyway. So let's sum up French's proposed solutions to the risks of violent secession that he laid out earlier in the book. First, we need to re-embrace pluralism, or the idea that America can contain many different opposing political perspectives rather than just one party that dominates everything. To French, this pluralism is bound up in respecting civil liberties, and specifically in respecting and indeed protecting the ability of others to utilize their civil liberties in ways that you may not agree with. Second, French calls on us to embrace tolerance, which he uses to mean begrudgingly accepting that you have to live alongside people with batshit political opinions, rather than trying to get rid of those people or casting them as evil. This is sort of just another facet of his push for more pluralism, in my opinion. Third, and clearly most importantly to French, we need to dedicate ourselves to good old-fashioned 18th century style federalism. We need to return more political control to the state level, which French argues will de-escalate federal-level tensions, restore local autonomy, and the feeling of political agency, and does make secession seem like an undesirable and unnecessary method to work towards to achieve political outcomes. Really showing off his conservative bona fides here by saying that the Founding Fathers got it right and we need to go back to the 1700s to save our country. And now, at long last, we can finally say the L word, localism. What does localism make of all this stuff about exits and pluralism that French is saying? And to what extent are French's theories compatible with localisms? Let's start off with the problem half of Divided We Fall. In other words, whether America is in danger of some kind of violent secession scenario because the four bad factors are present here. The answer is yes, with an asterisk. Because while localism does generally agree that the current political situation is conducive to violent political conflict and indeed violent secessionary conflict, we don't agree that a potential secession scenario would occur quite along the lines that French suggests. And we also don't totally agree that all four of French's factors for secession are present in America in the form that French presents them. As a reminder, French's four factors that give rise to violent secession risks are 1. Political division that has people on either side of the political divide viewing the opposition as enemies to destroy rather than rivals to defeat. 2. Regional homogeny, clear regional or other geographic divisions that neatly track differences in political and cultural traits. 3. Fear that those who live outside your homogeneous region are actively planning to take away your ability to self-govern and will instead impose unwanted political and cultural values. And 4. A willingness to be motivated by that fear to utilize violence as a way to defend or overcome the external parties you view as a threat. Let's go through these one by one and see whether they make sense to us from a localist perspective. First, political division that causes people on all sides of the political spectrum to view each other as enemies that must be destroyed. Oh yeah, localism definitely views that as a genuine issue. You don't need to do more than turn on your news program of choice to know that's a reality in America right now. We'd point out, though, that French sometimes tends to describe this issue as if it involves people who think this way, who are unenlightened or insufficiently egalitarian or whatever the fuck. Localism doesn't think that the current state of political discourse is good, but it also recognizes that it hasn't arisen due to personal failings or people being too dumb to realize we should all just get along or whatever. Instead, the winner-take-all, defeat-the-enemy mindset is a rational response to an irrational federal system that prevents people from achieving solely local political change. The reason why people are in a destroy-the-opposition frame of mind right now is because the road to addressing the issues they care about runs solely through federal and state legislatures that can only be captured through broad-reaching and generally gross party politics. The only way for you to make the right kind of healthcare a reality in your backyard, or to have a say in what your kids are learning in your local school, is to make sure that your team wins at the national level. Of course you're going to go all in on making sure that it's the guys with your jerseys who can win the game, and you're going to go all in treating the other team as bad guys. Rather than blaming people for realizing this fact and acting on it, we should be changing the system that forces us all to act this way. Just my 2 cents. We're going to skip element 2, regional homogenization, for now, and move on to factor 3, fear that those living outside your region want to come in and take away your rights. Localism certainly isn't going to contest that this is a prevailing fear. Hell, it's not just a fear, it's a reality. Not to keep beating a dead horse, but if the only way to achieve your desired political changes is to achieve them on a universal nationwide level, then yeah, wanting to achieve your preferred form of politics inherently means invading regions elsewhere that don't share your politics and imposing your view, values, and will on them. That's just the nature of the beast. And, of course, anyone living in a local government that doesn't have self-rule authority must grind their teeth every day and watch idiots in their state Congress override any local decision the politicians don't like. Believe you me, listener, right now there is some state politician in your state government plotting how they can take away your ability to make local decisions in some crucial aspect of your life. That's how fucked the relationship between state and local government is. Now we have ingredient 3, willingness to translate that fear of external control into the willingness to use violence to resist it. There's no doubt that this is present in America right now. They've tried to kill Trump twice, that we know about. Actually killed those Minnesota Democrat state politicians, shot Charlie Kirk, killed a United Healthcare CEO, and that's just this past calendar year. The temperature is rising every single day, it seems like. Violence isn't just on the table or being considered, it's becoming normalized as a political method. And that is truly localism's worst fear. Localism is all about preventing our communities from facing the chaos, terror, and death that are the inevitable result of such violence. We're not just a peaceful movement. We are a movement for peace, a movement that wants to lower the temperature and help usher in a system where the thought of using violence for political ends is ridiculous because there are concrete, immediate ways to exercise political agency in our own communities, and those ways are protected from outside interference. Look, even if you disagree with everything localism is about, and you think I'm just a lefty who likes the sound of his own voice and to sniff his own shit, I'm hoping that you'll listen to what I'm about to say. Fuck what you see on TV, or in the movies, or read in your books, or whatever. Periods of political violence and instability are horrible. When there's widespread, Ireland-style Troubles conflict happening in your own community, you don't feel like a cool, amazing revolution is happening, or get excited that you get to join up with your ideological gang of choice and fight the bad guys wholesome Chungus Star Wars style. Mostly you just spend a lot of time being fucking terrified, watching that daily fear seep into the lives of your friends and neighbors and family, watching them lose out on the ability to lead a happy, normal life a little more each day. And that's if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, then you get to watch those people in life you care about end up in the grave. You may end up there yourself. Do you know what it's like to be shot, what it feels like? I don't. And I don't ever want to find out. But unless something changes, that may very well be what's heading our way. We must avoid that possibility at all costs. French and I at least probably agree on that, though as a military guy who is undoubtedly braver than I am, he might be less afraid of the personal consequences of violence than me. But we definitely both agree we don't want violence breaking out in America. That is the worst possible outcome. Okay, so that's 3 thumbs up from localism on whether we agree with French on the presence of a toxic, destroy the enemy politics, fear that those politics will translate into an external force invading your community and destroying your autonomy, and the terrifying risk that this fear will translate into a spiral of violence. Which brings up the element we skipped, increased regional homogenization, or the idea that Americans are increasingly self-sorting into specific areas of the country that share their political and cultural values. Basically the idea that red areas are getting redder and blue areas are getting bluer. Here's the thing about this. Localism agrees with French that this regional homogenization is occurring. We just disagree with French about the basic unit of this homogenization. And explaining why we think French is wrong to suggest homogenization is a state-level trend will also help explain why we think French's 2 visions for how secession could play out, while undoubtedly vivid and plausible and disturbing, ultimately miss the mark for how political violence in America might ultimately play out. Here's what we see as the problem with French's regional homogenization analysis. I don't think he's wrong to say that red states are getting redder and blue states are getting bluer. All that stuff about states where one party controls both houses of the state legislature plus the governor, rising polarization, laying church attendance maps on top of voting maps and seeing that they're highly related, like all that is true. But it also fails to consider that the most important scale upon which regional homogenization is occurring is the urban-rural divide. We're just kind of looking at a state-level political map of America going, hey, look at that, California is getting more liberal and Alabama is getting more conservative. Clearly this means that we're getting these clean-cut borders between conservative and liberal regions in America because there are these red blocks of states and blue blocks of states. However, these state-level reviews are deceiving. They ignore the highly documented and indeed intensifying trend of blue liberal states having incredibly red rural areas, and red conservative states having pretty damn blue cities. I could cite some annoying stats at you or whatever, but I think I can explain what I'm getting at here with a pretty simple, intuitive example. Imagine you are meeting someone for the first time. Speed dating, social science study, bar chat, whatever. Personally, I hate talking to strangers in bars, but let's go with the bar example so I seem cool and socially adjusted and not like a guy who makes strange political podcasts. Okay, so say you're having a beer in a bar and somebody comes and sits down next to you. Your job is to figure out what this person's politics are, and all you get is one question to do it in. You get to ask them one thing, and then based on this person's answer, you have to make your most accurate guess about whether they're conservative or liberal. You can't just ask them, hey, what are your politics like? Because obviously that'd be very rude. Ready? Think about your question. I'll give you just a second more. Okay. So based on the way French wrote divided we fall, in theory, a really good question you could ask is, hey, if you don't mind me asking, what state are you from? And to be sure, that's not a bad question. If this bar stranger says Alabama, it's not a bad bet that he's probably Republican. And if the bar stranger says New York, probably a decent bet he's liberal. But what if there was an even better question to ask? What if instead of going, what state are you from, we instead ask, hey man, weird question, but do you live in a city, in a kind of a rural area, or in the suburbs? And I guarantee you that the answer to this question is going to give you a much higher chance of accurately guessing his politics. If the person goes, oh, I live in a pretty big city, then they have a really damn good chance of being liberal, regardless of whether that big city is Chicago, Illinois, or Austin, Texas. And if they go, oh, I live somewhere pretty rural, then they have a pretty damn good chance of being conservative, regardless of whether that rural area is Monroe County, Mississippi, or Hamilton County in New York State. Here's another way to get my point across. Pull up an election results map from 2024. Literally just Google presidential election results 2024 and click on the images tab and look at the results. For me, the first result is a state-level map, one that seems to show a regional picture that aligns pretty strongly with French's point. The red states are clustered together, the blue states are clustered together, big bang boom. But then I want you to click on a county and municipality level presidential election results map, and you'll see a very different story. Wikipedia has a good one of these, and if you want to see actual voting percentages for each of the counties in America, then, may God forgive me for even uttering this word, Politico has great interactable maps that give a county-by-county breakdown. And as these breakdowns show, the notion that we can sweep up a state as being categorically Republican or categorically Democratic is just false. Instead, even the bluest states have some parts that are super intensely red, and even the reddest states have some parts that are really intensely blue. Thus, we have Modoc, hopefully I'm saying that right, Modoc County, California, going 70% for Trump, and 57% of people in Jefferson County, Kentucky, breaking for Harris. This despite the fact that California is on paper one of the bluest states in the country, and Kentucky on paper is one of the reddest states in the country. But I don't need to cite these stats to you. You know this intuitively. You know that whatever state you happen to live in, if you're American, there's the broad reputation of, oh yeah, ha ha ha, we're big Republican or big Democrats here, or whatever. And then there's the more complicated and accurate story that unfolds when you actually look at the dynamics within your state. Now, French is correct that political siloing and regional polarization is occurring. It's just occurring along rural-urban lines rather than state by state. And because he doesn't get down to that granular local level, French just kind of assumes we can draw a circle around conservative regions and say, okay, everyone living within the circle is mostly on the same team, and then do the same for groups of liberal states. He then suggests that those homogenous areas would be willing to work together in a mostly harmonious manner in order to achieve secession and ultimately a new, much more homogenous country. That's the basic premise underlying his Texas and Calixtus scenarios. But that's just not the case. There is no way in hell that rural Californians are going to line up and accept that they're just part of a new liberal California nation now, were California to try to secede. Their response to a successful secession by California would be an immediate campaign to return their parts of the state back to the U.S. California can't just stand up and declare, okay, our whole state is a country now. There'd be chaos. There'd be nothing less than a statewide churn of civil and maybe even violent unrest, with rural Second Amendment-loving Californians engaging in sabotage, assassinations, militia maneuvering, the whole 9 yards. And then California would have a choice. The state government can either go, okay, fine, we'll let the rural areas go back to America, and with them sacrifice the incredibly vital and incredibly profitable agricultural and other resources located in those rural areas, thereby cutting the new nation off at the knees, or it has to engage in some kind of miserable campaign of repression in the outlying rural areas of the state, which will at best be highly expensive and unpopular and generate terrible publicity, and at worst could involve being slowly bled to death by a partisan rural insurgency that now sees all its worst and most conspiratorial fears coming true. This sounds fucking horrible for all involved, and it is still better than what might occur in some kind of Texas or other southern conservative state secession scenario. At least in California, or another conceivable liberal analog, liberal and conservative areas of the state are somewhat cleanly divisible. That's just not the case in many of these red states that French suggests would play a part in Texas. They all have these blue pearls buried within them that are very strongly democratic, and that would very strongly resist any attempt for the state to leave. And if these states did form these own countries, what are these blue urban residents going to do? Are they just going to accept and go, well, okay, I guess we live in a conservative country now that doesn't give us all the rights that we had before? No, of course not. They're going to actively resist. They're probably going to violently resist. And because these cities are both strong population centers and also strong economic engines for the entire state. It's not like these conservative states turned one new conservative country are just going to be like, well, we're going to let these areas in the middle of ourselves still be part of America or be their own country or whatever. No, they're going to have to go in and control these areas. And that will probably mean violent repression campaigns in cities that will be extremely well publicized, result in death and injury and misery, and really decades of conflict before either the urban liberal centers just wear the conservative government out, make them decide that the cost of more treasure and more blood to bring these cities to heal isn't worth it anymore, or these cities get crushed and in really nasty purges, liberals are just ejected or repressed until they give up on the idea of continuing to exercise their own degree of autonomy. Again, when you look at a map of a conservative state, it really is a sea of red with a couple blue islands in it. This isn't some situation where you can just neatly divide off the blue parts. No, they are in the middle of everything. And conservative governments, should they break away and form a new country, are going to be forced to choose how they want to bring these places under control. And the only ways to bring them under control will be violent, messy, horrible, and destructive. We do get just a little bit of this reality in French's scenarios. Remember that in the Calix's scenario, there is some mention of rural Californians fighting back against the gun seizures. And in Texas, there is some discussion of riots that break out in liberal Texas cities while the state moves towards secession. But not enough, I think, to show that French has accurately grappled with the problem that the states he treats as political monoliths are in fact far more politically diverse than he depicts them as. Certainly, it does nothing to discuss the immediate and terrifying flare-ups that would occur within states in the event the secession actually went through. Flare-ups that would be particularly nasty because the outgroups in either scenario, the rural conservatives in a liberal state or the urban liberals in a conservative state, quite literally would have nothing left to lose. It would be their nightmare apocalypse scenario, and you would see a lot of destructive nihilistic behavior because of that. Imagine you're facing the choice between fighting back, taking up arms against a country that you didn't want to be a part of and that you had no desire to form, or accepting life in that new country that you don't want to be in and that is actively hostile to your culture and values. That is not an environment conducive to social harmony or peace. This dovetails nicely into a quick but really important note about how localism views secession. Remember that, at least in the Calix's scenario, French at times kind of flirted with the idea that secession might not be so bad, that it might create two more homogenous countries that were less militarily involved abroad and where people could live in harmony with those that share their politics. This is all that burst of energy as the people strove to build a nation stronger and better than their new rivals. And one great experiment in freedom and democracy ended, another great experiment began. Shit. Let me be absolute and unequivocal on this point. Localism rejects secession as a solution to America's political ills. For one, not to start waving the flag, but I happen to love my country and think it's the best one in the world. I don't want to see it split into two or more parts that might be shiny and new or whatever, but wouldn't be America anymore, would bring an end to our story of struggle and reckoning with our own sins and attempts to become something more, something better. Still, arguably more importantly, secession just wouldn't work to create the autonomy, agency, and security that we all crave. For all the reasons we've just discussed in detail, all state secession would accomplish is to generate a new, massive, violent, destructive, and above all fucking terrifying conflict within the newly seceded state or states. Sure, maybe Republicans in Texas and liberals in California would be having a great time, but California is not just liberals, and Texas is not just MAGA Republicans. What about the people left behind? In the same way that secession is supposedly about adopting a political system that more accurately represents the values and preferences of the governed, what about the values and preferences of wide parts of the state that now have been thrust into a country that they want no part of? No. Localism refuses to countenance this as a desirable solution. Instead, to achieve autonomy and agency in a political system that actually gives a shit about what average people want to do in their own communities, we need to embrace a solution that gives you the power to enact change in your own community without fucking over other places in America and allows other places in America to do what they want without fucking you over. Secession is not, will not, and cannot be that solution. Because having your state break away and become its own country just recreates all the problems of failed agency and distant control that already exist in America, except in an even more charged, dangerous, and repressive context. If you disagree and think we should be trying to leave America, sorry, that view just isn't compatible with localism. So that's how localism views the problem half of Divided We Fall. General agreement with French that the current political situation presents grave threats of political violence and separatism. However, we don't agree that secession will play out in the way that French depicts it, and we categorically reject his occasional implication that secession would actually bring about good or desirable outcomes. What about the solution half of Divided We Fall? Well, kind of like localism's position towards French's ideas in the problem half of Divided We Fall, the situation is more complicated than localism viewing French as purely right or wrong, weird revision on the American Revolution aside, but there is some pretty substantial disagreement here about how French suggests we can get out of these violent secession risks. Let's go through French's proposed solutions one by one. First, pluralism. Love it. Love everything about it. Localism is all about pluralism. Why? Because the basic pitch of localism, really the biggest ideological concept within localism, is that local government should have vastly more self-rule authority, because that is the level of government that is the most accountable to and the most changeable by average people. And a localist America would be a vastly more pluralist nation than the current heavily top-down model. Imagine if instead of needing to fight against a huge mass of strangers who live hundreds of miles away from you every time you want to pass a law in your own backyard, you could just pass the law, because your locality has inherent authority to do so, and it would only apply where you live. It wouldn't apply across the whole country. Imagine if instead of making these incredible broad-sweeping and thus necessarily universalizing political coalitions pull from all corners of the nation in order to achieve success in the zero-sum game of federal politics, your quote-unquote political party was just those who you agreed with, that lived in your community. Imagine if implementing something you agreed with at home, say a change in healthcare policy, didn't fuck over those who lived elsewhere in the country who had a different view on how healthcare should work, and the decision they made in their community about healthcare wouldn't affect your ability to make your own decisions about what makes sense in your own backyard. Such a situation would naturally lead to massively more political diversity and acceptance of other politics across the country. As I've said before on this podcast, all else equal, a progressive liberal in Berkeley, California, and a deep red MAGA conservative in Midland County, Texas, shouldn't actually have a reason to hate each other. They live hundreds of miles apart in vastly different communities that aren't so entangled that they would ordinarily need to deal with one another in ways that are more than passing. The reason why they hate each other now, and why they spend so much time thinking about how the other is an enemy, is because the federal winner-takes-all system means that they inevitably have to defeat one another in order to achieve policy changes in their own communities. Similarly, one of the reasons that mainstream political parties are so milquetoast and mostly manage to piss everyone off is because they have to be national coalitions to succeed on the national stage, which means ignoring local variation or preference and instead embracing whatever set of bare minimum values you can get the biggest number of people to grudgingly sign on to. Once political decision-making is recentered in local government, you don't need to engage in that nationwide compromise that everyone hates shit anymore. Creating third parties or trying out new political ideas or policies isn't a death sentence. You don't need to convince the whole country that your wacky idea makes sense, just the people who you live and work alongside in your own community. That's going to translate into a much more interesting and varied political field than the one our current politics allows. And for localism, the two prices the French describes we have to pay to achieve that pluralism are worth paying and are inherent to the social contract that localism represents. Most obviously, nothing in localism disrupts the presence of federal-level constitutional rights, which will, of course, continue to take precedence over anything done at local or any other level of government that attempts to impose on guaranteed civil liberties. So the price of defending constitutional rights is not too tough to pay. In fact, protecting those civil liberties is a core priority of localism. Indeed, localism gives us a new civil liberty, essential to the social fabric that people of all political stripes can rally around: the right of self-determination in our own communities free of interference from those who live elsewhere. Put more plainly, it's the civil right to avoid having to deal with one another, because we all hate each other's guts. That hatred is, for better or worse, the greatest unifying element in our country right now, even in these extremely divided times. Hell, because of these extremely divided times, we can all agree that we hate each other, and thus can all agree that we should have more ability to do things in our own communities, so we don't have to deal with each other so much. As for the second price, protecting the ability of other individuals to use the civil liberties in ways we don't agree with, that is something that localism finds agreeable and is willing to work to achieve. After all, so long as me and my fellow community members are the ones who get to decide how things work where we live, We don't have to care if people are using their First Amendment rights at another city in a way we don't like. And we don't have to care if people are more or less aggressive about the Second Amendment in a state halfway across the country. Because at the end of the day, we call the shots where we live. So there being people who live differently elsewhere in the state or the country is no longer a threat, in the same way that it was in the winner-take-all top-down federal system. To be clear, though, losing the ability to say how things are done elsewhere is a price. It is a genuine sacrifice. No matter what your politics are, if you sign on to localism, you're signing on to seeing things done in parts of the country that offend you deeply, and maybe even shock your conscience. And by embracing pluralism through localism, you're going to lose the ability to say that the people doing the things you oppose should act better, treat people with greater respect, or stop forcing a worldview down other people's throats that you don't agree with. You're going to see people suffering, and you'll have given up the small degree of control that you had previously to influence things such that the suffering could stop. That sucks. I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't suck. What I will say, and what I think is one of the basic pitches of localism, is that what you're buying for that cost is the ability to keep doing what you know is right in your own community, even when some freak from the north or south or east or west starts screaming on the internet about how what you're doing is wrong or gross. More plainly, I think that paying the price of less control over what happens elsewhere in exchange for more autonomy at home is a more than worthy exchange. And it also just happens to be the exchange necessary to achieve pluralism. What about French's interesting reframing of tolerance? Again, this is something that localism both agrees with and embodies. In fact, I would go so far as to say there is no political reform that embodies French's tolerance more than localism. Because localism is all about saying, fine, okay, I hate what they're doing in states across the country and also in my own state just 2 counties over, but you know what? That's not where I live. That's not where I am. So I'm going to surrender any and all power I have to affect what goes on in those other areas. I'm just going to accept that they're going to do their own backward, insane shit over there. Because you know what? Thanks to localism, where my laws and my politics are completely under my own community's control, I don't have to care what's going on in those other places anymore. Do what you want. I'm just going to focus on how to change things where I am. In other words, under localism, you don't have to like what's going on in places outside your community. Quite the opposite. You can hate it with all your heart. All you have to do is accept that it's not your monkeys and not your circus. In exchange for that acceptance, you get the full power to make all the important political decisions that matter within your own community. And last, but certainly not least, we have French's favorite solution: federalism, returning to a system of government where the feds are doing less and the states are doing more. This is where localism severely and probably fatally diverges from French's ideology. And that's because despite French waxing poetic about how federalism, in other words, state-level control over everything, would provide a much greater degree of local control and would allow laws to become variable, customized for local interests and local values, that just straight up is not true. Giving more power to state governments would not result in greater local control. Giving more power to state governments would not result in locally minded policy tailored to your preferences and values. Local control is anathema to state politicians. They hate it, they despise it, and that hatred is built right into our political system. To echo what we discussed in the episodes about Dillon's Rule versus Home Rule and the Localist Pitch, both of which are great episodes, by the way, go listen to them, the prevailing legal understanding of local authority in America is that local governments have no inherent authority. Zero. None. They are instead mere creations, creatures, subordinate bodies of the state government, and thus the state government can create, destroy, or limit their powers at the state's will. Think about the relationship between the states and the federal government. The federal government's powers over state and local government, while preemptory, are at least limited. The feds can only exercise the powers explicitly granted in the federal Constitution, and the 10th Amendment specifically limits the federal government's authority while reserving any non-granted authority to the states. There is no such limitation present in the relationship between state and local government in any state that I am aware of. States have basically complete power over local governments, hindered only by whatever restrictions might be present in the state constitution. So devolving power to the state level doesn't actually solve any of the problems French is claiming he wants to solve. You don't get more power to decide things in your own community. You don't get new authority to take local action and make local decisions. Instead, all you've done is trade one set of politicians out for another. And this new set, the state set, yeah, they can just come in and blow up your local government and local laws and local politics and local views whenever they feel like it. And in America, where there are severe political divisions within the same state, where even the deepest red state can have insanely blue cities and the most progressive strongholds can have intensely Republican rural areas, the inevitable result of giving state governments more power will be that outgroups within every state will be crushed. There will be no autonomy. There will be no pluralism. There will only be distant politicians imposing their will on you from afar, bolstered by voters from outside your community that hate your guts and want to destroy the way you live your life. Sure, those distant politicians might be 50 or 100 miles away instead of all the way in D.C., and the voters outside your community that outnumber you might be from 2 counties over rather than a different coast, but that's hardly a ringing fucking endorsement of why we should all seek to embrace federalism. To absolutely mangle and repurpose a well-known quote, the people will feel no better if the stick with which they are being beaten is labeled state government instead of federal government. But French's impulses here aren't totally off base. He's right that the antidote to political violence and to our toxic national politics is to devolve decision-making to a more immediate, more accountable, more flexible, and more pluralistic level of government. He's right that at the end of the day, what people want is a greater degree of local control, a greater say in the laws they follow, and policy that's tailored to their specific community. He's just wrong about what level of government we need to devolve authority to in order to achieve those goods. Surprise, the political movement called localism says we should give power to local governments. Not state government, not federal government, local government. Local government is the closest and most accountable form of government to you, the listener. It's literally where you live, work, and sleep. The people who run it depend on your vote in a way that absolutely no state or federal politician ever will. And if you follow the democratizing half of localism, it's the place where you can literally engage in direct self-rule by casting votes yourselves on laws that address the things that matter to you. The people within the jurisdiction of your local government aren't a distant mass of out-of-touch, uninformed, actively hostile people. They're your friends and neighbors and rivals, your emergency responders, your teachers, your garbage men. You definitely won't agree on everything, or even most things, but you all share a community of interest because you are all part of the same community. And let me tell you, there's a lot of times where the politics of your local government are going to go in a way that you don't agree with. And that'll suck. It'll maybe even hurt worse than when you lose out because a federal or state law preempted you, or because you lost out in a state or national election due to hundreds of thousands of distant people who simply outweighed your own voice. Because when you lose on the local level, it means that the people closest to you, the ones who walk your same streets and live and work alongside you, rejected your view of fundamental issues. That's really going to hurt. It's going to be a gut punch. But you know what? Even when you lose, even when the community does something that just makes you sick to your stomach, ultimate public action feels earned, justified, acceptable in a way that similar political failures in the current system just don't. This wasn't a mass of distant strangers imposing their will on you from afar. This wasn't a stupid system where a law passed hundreds or thousands of miles away is somehow considered to be a more accurate representation of the public will than what's in the heads and hearts of you and your neighbors. No, you just straight up lost. And you lost because your community doesn't agree with you. That's terrible, but it's also so much better than what we have now. And on those rare times where everyone does agree, those moments where everybody in the community gets together and does something on the local level, something that wouldn't have been possible in the pre-localist system, something where you and your community flex your self-rule muscles to accomplish an amazing change, where you can feel your values and preferences and personal efforts translated into an actual improvement that you brought about with your own hands. My God, man. It's an amazing feeling. It's indescribable. And when you have that local avenue available to you, that local focused system where it's you and the people who live around you making the decisions, and where all victories and all losses are a clear emanation and genuine embodiment of community will, there is no more need for fear that distant people and distant movements and distant political parties are going to seize control over you. There is neither need nor desire to engage in violence because you view it as the only way to achieve anything of political substance. Agency, accountability, and self-determination. That's exactly what we need during this time of political terror. And that is exactly by design and intention what localism and devolving decision-making authority down to the local level and then embracing direct democracy would provide. French's federalism, throwing all power to those party politics goons in the state legislature who are just going to use that new power to shit all over their political opponents as hard, if not harder, than the party politics goons in the federal Congress. The state government that, thanks to Dillon's rule and the understanding of local governments as being mere creatures and conveniences of the state, have even more power over you than the federal government does. The same state government where you have maybe one state senator and one state representative who need to pretend to give a shit about you, and literally every other state politician there is ambivalent at best and actively hostile at worst to your interests because they serve solely people outside your community? Yeah, federalism isn't going to do what French promises it will. Federalism isn't going to do what we need. For that, we need localism. And you know what? Just to be a hater, God knows this podcast is nothing if not a podcast written by and for haters. I'm going to end this show on a negative note by flinging a bit of mud at French. French is a Harvard Law grad. He is far smarter than I will ever be. He is a political expert, arguably a political genius. There is absolutely no way that he does not realize that his assumption that American homogenization is playing out on the state level is flawed. There is zero chance that he fails to appreciate that the urban-rural divide is the defining predictor in American politics, bar almost no other measure. He definitely can appreciate the nature of the relationship between state and local government, and how local governments have even less to protect them against state governments than they do against the federal government. And yet, he still puts forward a federalist, state government empowering solution rather than a localist solution. Why? Well, I can't prove for certain. All I can say is my own biased opinion. And in my own biased opinion, despite his veneer of both sidesism and, oh, I'm an independent now, and I love pluralism, and I just want everyone to make their own decisions, French is really just a conservative partisan at heart. He knows that conservatives control most state houses in America, far more than half. He hates the policies and viewpoints that he sees as liberal excesses that flow out of blue urban areas. So he proposes a solution that would ensure the permanent ascendancy of his preferred political class. He proposes a solution that he knows would ensure that the undesirables would be crushed and their autonomy stripped away. And at the end of the day, by encouraging authority to be devolved to the state level, French reveals himself to be just like the people he rightfully casts as dangerous, an American who wants to achieve his preferred political outcomes by taking away the ability of others to self-rule rather than accepting that others outside his community can and should be able to live in the ways that they want. There's the skeleton of some really good ideas and concepts in Divided We Fall. But localism is ultimately a political movement that truly is about achieving maximum local autonomy in exchange for sacrificing almost all ability to influence what happens outside of where you live. That makes it incompatible with David French's vision of state governments that rule over us from a slightly closer afar. And that's the end of today's show. Wow, this episode ended up being a lot longer than I had thought it would. As with Bookchin, my love language is complaining, and I actually love French's Divided We Fall quite a bit. It's a fascinating book, and so I was excited to have a chance to gripe about it. But with our discussion of Divided We Fall over, this also marks the ending, at least for now, of our Book Chats arc. It's been so fun to have this chance to rant about all these books I like, and I'm so lucky to have had the chance to share my thoughts with you all. However, for the foreseeable future, we'll be moving past literacy and returning to our past unga-bunga practice of discussing general political topics or explaining concepts associated with localism. Since we'll be, getting back into the groove of things, hopping back on the horse, let's start things off nice and easy, shall we? Let me just look at the old shelf of non-controversial political topics and pull something down. Here's a good one. Surely this is a simple one that we all can agree about and won't generate any controversy whatsoever. So yeah, come back next time as we do localism and immigration and dive into how localism views current events relating to that area. Shouldn't be hard at all, right? Catch you then. If that sounds interesting, please be sure to follow us on Spotify or on our YouTube channel at LocalistPod. That's Localist with a T, pod. If these long-form podcasts aren't your thing, then we also do these great 3-minute-long YouTube shorts that give a more condensed version of the podcast episodes. And check us out on Blue Sky at localistpod.bluesky.social. Finally, if you have any questions or comments, send me an email at localistpod, again that's localist with a T, pod @gmail.com. Catch you guys later.
A huge thank you to Kevin McLeod for letting me use the 2 songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompatible.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.